well as one of our sister museums, the Ukrainian Museum of Canada Alberta branch in Edmonton, are both situated in Treaty 6 territory. Treaty 6 was signed in August 1876 as an agreement between the Canadian Crown and various Cree, Nakota, and other band governments at Fort Carleton and Fort Pitt, then in the Northwest Territories, today in Saskatchewan. This treaty, like all the treaties that came before and after it, was intended to provide a framework for European and other settlers to share and respect the land that Indigenous peoples have occupied since time immemorial. Our Ukrainian ancestors who came to the prairie provinces all became treaty people from the moment they arrived, since Treaty 6 was signed 20 years before our arrival. The Ukrainian bloc settlements in the prairies extend in a kind of swoop from the northwest down to the southeast, starting just above Edmonton and then down across Saskatchewan to southeast Manitoba. And so those are Treaties 6, 4, 2, and 1 for the most part. So all the other treaties that Ukrainians arrived to were signed even earlier than Treaty 6. I wanted to explain this tonight to make clear that Ukrainian settlers have always had an obligation to help uphold the treaties, but we haven't always done so. Like other settler groups, we've often ignored our obligations or even not understood that we have them. When Russia launched its full-scale assault on Ukraine nearly 2 years ago, on February 24th, 2022, many Indigenous people across Canada demonstrated their solidarity with Ukrainians by wearing their kukum scarves, or their babushka scarves. And this was evidence to them of long relations between Ukrainian settlers and Indigenous people in the prairies, going back to our earliest days here. This was very heartwarming to see at that time, and even if it was not intended as such, it was also a call to action for Ukrainians in Canada who were busy condemning Russian imperialism. It was a call for us to come to understand our own role in colonization here and to unlock our memories from the early days when Ukrainians, compared to other settlers, some Ukrainians, seem to have had particularly close relationships with Indigenous communities and families. This is what the Ukrainian Museum of Canada has set out to do, with the hope that by developing a better understanding of the past, we can contribute to the building of a better future here, in which reparations are made to those who've been disenfranchised by our arrival and true reconciliation can take place. So it's with that goal tonight that we've invited Jessy Lee Saas to speak to us about revisiting Ukrainian settler stories in the context of colonialism. Jessy Lee Saas is a PhD candidate in history at the University of Saskatchewan, and her research focuses on Canadian prairie history, specifically in areas of gender, decolonization, and Indigenous histories. Her master's thesis, which I found online looking for the very scant material that exists on Ukrainian Indigenous relations in the early years, explores Ukrainian settler and Indigenous stories and relationships in southern Saskatchewan during the homesteading period. Recently, Jessy Lee worked on an oral history project at Ilarion retirement residence, recording the lived experiences of Ukrainians in Saskatchewan. The museum has begun exploring Ukrainian Indigenous relations in some private gatherings with Indigenous community members. And in this work, I'm really pleased to have been joined by Dawn Wasakase, who's here tonight, who's my partner in organizing those events, and she's helping with the research that we're doing. This is our first public event related to this subject, but it's far from our last. I'm thrilled to have Jessy Lee here, as so few scholars have deliberately engaged with this topic, and we're lucky to have Jessy Lee right here in Saskatoon. So finally, I'll just add, as a relatively new professional to the Heritage Museum field, my background is in contemporary art, I have on occasion, in making my rounds to other heritage museums and reading through their material, been rather bowled over by how stubborn and stuck heritage museums seem to be in presenting the same old stories told in the same ways over and over again. So many of these museums are also struggling. They're struggling to build support. They're struggling for audiences. They're struggling to remain relative. So telling our stories differently, more inclusively, more honestly, and more critically, I think is a moral obligation. But more than that, I think it's our only means of ensuring that we have a future. Young people today are growing up with a truer sense of Canadian history. Our public schools are raising kids as treaty people. And so thank you, Saskatchewan Teachers Federation. If we want to continue to bring in audiences who see our work as meaningful and interesting, we need to catch up to where young people are already today and to where teachers are today, so many of whom are actually young enough to be my children. So this talk is about, tonight, what came before, but also about what lies ahead. I encourage everyone here tonight in this room, and anybody who's watching this later on our YouTube channel, to listen to Jessy Lee's discussion of the past with a very open heart, and with an understanding that what she's giving us is a pathway to a better tomorrow. Please join me in welcoming Jessy Lee Saas.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. As Jen said, my name is Jessy Lee Saas, and I am a PhD student here at the University of Saskatchewan. I'm very glad to be here. This is a full room, so this makes me extremely happy. I do study Canadian prairie history. I consider myself to be a historian in training, and also I am a settler. And so I'm here today to talk about, and to encourage us all to think about stories, especially the stories that we know and the stories that we tell. And so I will begin with one of my own. I was raised in Moose Jaw on Treaty 4 land, the territory of the Nihiwa, the Plains Cree, the Lakota, Nakota, Dakota, Saulteaux, and the homelands of the Métis. I am a sixth-generation settler. My grandmother's family arrived in Canada from England and settled on a homestead near Frobisher on Treaty 2 territory in 1898. My grandfather's family came from Ukraine to farm in the Melville region on Treaty 4 land in 1903. My love for history comes from my grandparents. They are both educators and storytellers. As an only child, I have spent countless afternoons with them, driving around southern Saskatchewan in search of abandoned homesteads. We explore the houses together. We walk along old cattle fences and along forgotten dirt roads, much like this one. And all the while, I would listen. And therefore, perhaps it is not surprising that I've ended up here as a prairie historian who is fascinated by the way that we tell homesteading histories. For my master's thesis, as was alluded to before, I studied homesteading stories of British and Ukrainian settler families in southern Saskatchewan. I researched how these narratives settlers tell influence how we understand our place within the history of colonialism in Canada, in Saskatchewan, and more specifically, how we understand this history of colonialism in our local communities and in our own family histories. So these photos here are all of Ukrainian families who came and settled in Saskatchewan. They all arrived for different reasons, and they all settled in different locations. In this photo alone, we have families from Lintlaw, Spalding, Judberg, and Ituna. They all farmed, they all raised children, they all attended church, they all built a community, and they all made home here. And all of these families have their own stories of experiences here on the prairies. Today, my hope is to encourage a rethinking of these homesteader and settler narratives that are so prevalent in Saskatchewan. During the early homesteading period in Saskatchewan, which was around 1880 to 1910, Indigenous and settler relationships were commonplace. And interestingly, they were often mundane. In family narratives shared by settlers, Indigenous encounters were, in a sense, every day. They were not surprising, they were not frightening, they were not violent. They were just part of the day-to-day life in the homesteading era. And so I'm going to focus on one aspect of my research here tonight. Stories of early homesteading Ukrainian relationships with Indigenous peoples. I revisit these stories and I ask, what is really happening? What is being talked about and what is not? Why is it important to rethink or recontextualize these stories? And how can we do so? I will show that while Ukrainian homesteader stories are stories about hardship and perseverance, they are also stories about displacement and oppression of Indigenous peoples. And so, for our next 40 or so minutes together here, it will go a bit like this. I will start off by doing a background on settlement history in Saskatchewan, and I will touch on what colonialism is, what it looks like, and how it is enacted on personal levels. Then I will turn to a few Ukrainian settler stories to use as an example for how this work of revisiting settler stories can be done and why it should be done. And I do want to emphasize here that my goal is not to minimize Ukrainian homesteader experiences, but to re-examine these everyday stories and experiences in the context of settler colonialism. This is the work and responsibility of all settlers, Ukrainian and non-Ukrainian, to confront their own settler stories as people who continue to live on Indigenous lands. And so we will begin. Saskatchewan was a prairie of speargrass, blue grama, wheatgrass, aspen groves, and the prairie of well-traveled trails for Métis hunting parties. There were established fur trade forts and trading routes, trampled portage riverbanks. To the south, large triangular sod markers were built along the 49th parallel to mark a border with the United States. The changing seasons brought blizzards, floods, and droughts. The grasslands transformed into a cattle range, the prairie fringe turned to grain. Homesteaders planned, plowed, and pulled the land into lines, using Caragana windbreaks, range roads, telephone wires, split rail fences, and crop rows. And it was in these constantly changing landscapes of the 1880s to 1910s that southern Saskatchewan was settled. Shortly after Canada's Confederation in 1867, the federal government in Ottawa began focusing on the agricultural potential in the prairies. Previously, the West was seen by European powers as a land for fur trade opportunities. But now, the goal of the Canadian prairies was to cultivate, protect, and encourage agriculture. And by agriculture, the government meant wheat farming. And, however, there was a problem with this plan. The government may have deemed the West open for settlement, but the land was not empty. The prairies needed to be turned from Indigenous lands to settler lands, and to do so, the federal government passed various policies, such as the Indian Act, as a means to control and assimilate Indigenous peoples. In the 1870s, on behalf of the British Crown, Canada signed the numbered treaties with various Indigenous nations. According to the Canadian government, the treaties meant Indigenous nations relinquished all control of and claim to their lands, whereas Indigenous nations understood the treaties to be a formalized agreement to share the lands. During the Treaty 6 negotiations in 1876, the Treaty Commissioner told the Cree that 1 square mile of reserve land would be allocated to every family of 5. In response, Poundmaker, who was a Cree chief, replied, "This is our land. This isn't a piece of pemmican to be cut off and given back to us in little pieces." And yet, agents of the federal government did cut up the land, handing little pieces back to Indigenous peoples. The rest of the land, through the Dominion Land Act, divided native prairie into free quarter sections. And I use the word free here pretty lightly. It was free to any young man who was over the age of 18, and if he could pay a $10 fee. He also had to meet certain improvement requirements within a set number of years, and then in order to actually own the land. And on top of that, he had to be a British subject if he was not one already. And so we can see here that this is on the side there, that's the graph, that's what the surveyor team imagined and set out to do for the Canadian prairies. And we can see the legacy of those sections, the 36 sections divided into 4 quarter sections on the landscape today. This surveyed land cut the prairie into paper-perfect squares and made the patchwork quilt landscape that is so quintessential to the Saskatchewan that we know today. And therefore, it was in the wake of these actions that Western Canada was marketed as the last best West. At this time in the United States, the frontier was deemed closed, meaning that the land was settled and that there was no more expansive acres of free land for pioneers. Yet in Canada, the process was just beginning. The Canadian prairies were deemed the best of and the last of any land in the West. The Canadian Pacific Railway advertised lush wheat fields and discounted train tickets. Government agents in cities in Canada and in England encouraged citizens from overpopulated working classes to move. Prairie colonization companies tried to entice settlers to the prairies with the promise of land. Individuals actively recruited settlers, as Dr. Joseph Oslo did for Ukrainians. Everywhere one turned during these years, they were faced with images of Western Canada as being an agricultural utopia. And this advertisement worked. In less than 10 years, from 1896 to 1905, over 115,000 settlers filed for homesteads in Saskatchewan alone. Yet the homesteaders that the Canadian government wanted were white, English-speaking, young, hardworking men. And it was under the guidance and policy of 2 ministers of the Interior, Clifford Sifton and Frank Oliver, that the agricultural utopia of the Canadian prairies was grounded in a society that reflected British values. And it was these settlement policies enforced by Sifton and Oliver that influenced who settled in Saskatchewan and where their claims were made. For many Ukrainian settlers, arriving in Saskatchewan was more than following promotional literature that promised agricultural prosperity. Ukrainian settlers feeling oppression and poverty in their homelands arrived in Canada hoping for a fresh start for their families. They arrived following kinship networks, children following parents, sisters following brothers, friends following neighbors. And Ukrainian settlers from Galicia and Bukovina drew their sense of culture, beliefs, and practices from their densely forested environments at the base of the Carpathian Mountains. And by settling in the wooded park belt of the prairies, Ukrainians were able to create a sense of homeness, which resembled those found in Ukraine. These homes often had thatched roofs and packed earth floors. And here in these 2 photos, both from families in Saskatchewan. On the one side there, we can see a young child, her name's Adele. She's being held by her grandmother. Her family grew up in Theodore. Her grandmother lived in Sheehoe, just down the road. This is an example of generations of Ukrainian families coming and settling in same communities. The Shuchuk homestead here was built in the 1920s. And here as well, we can see the whitewashed clay walls of the house, again, a typical Ukrainian style home. And on the top of the image, I don't think we can see too clearly here, someone has written, "Our palace, which dwells on a hilltop." And this shows here that this is more than just someone building a house, this is building home. And this space becomes more than just a place to live in, it becomes a place to treasure memories and to continue to have culture. And these acts, along with government manipulation and pressure, allowed Ukrainians to settle in close-knit communities. These Ukrainian bloc settlements in Saskatchewan meant that communities could primarily be Ukrainian. So here is a map of how those settlements looked throughout the 3 prairie provinces. Sorry, I could have done that before. All right. And yet it was the Canadian government's efforts to contain and restrict Indigenous peoples which made settlement possible to begin with. These were federally administered policies and institutions. There was the residential schools to assimilate and eradicate Indigenous culture and language through children, reserves to displace and confine and separate Indigenous peoples, the pass system to restrict and police Indigenous movement, Métis scrip and road allowance to displace and take Métis land, and the forced removal of all Indigenous peoples. These were the reasons settlers could take their place on the prairies. And often these stories of Indigenous displacement, relocation, oppression, and assimilation, or the stories of residential schools and reserves, are told separately from stories of settler arrival and homesteading. However, these two stories are deeply interconnected. They're happening at the same time, and they're happening in the same places. When settlers arrived to the prairies to build a home, they arrived during ongoing Indigenous removal from home. This is the story of Saskatchewan, and it is a story of settler colonialism. Settler colonialism strives to permanently remove Indigenous peoples from their land, and in the process erase Indigenous land claims and eliminate their cultures through displacement, assimilation, or genocide. This is done to make room for newcomers who will lay exclusive claims to the land and inscribe their own cultural beliefs and practices onto the land. Individual farmers may not have created reserves or administered residential schools in Canada, but they arrived with the expectation that they would have private ownership over land and its resources. In the past, settlers have suggested that since they were not aware of Indigenous displacement or oppression, they cannot and should not be held accountable for the effects of settler colonialism on Indigenous peoples in the prairie region. However, my archival research into Saskatchewan settler family history stories shows that Indigenous peoples were present, visible, and active in settler stories of the homesteading period. In these memories, few settlers directly link their arrival, their efforts to establish homes and communities, and their continued occupation on the land as acts of settler colonialism. Yet these stories that settlers do share demonstrate that they were not only aware of their Indigenous neighbors, but they also had close relationships that extended beyond the helpful Indian trope. And these settler stories show that they were aware of Indigenous displacement practices happening at the time. So in this photo here, at a first glance, it could appear as some settlers having a picnic, which they are. However, further context tells us that these settlers are having a picnic on the sweetgrass reserve. And as they sit here on their picnic, they're looking out over the prairie and onto Cree homes. These stories are happening at the same time, and they're happening in the same places. So as we revisit these settler stories, it is important to keep in mind the context of settler colonialism. My goal is not to minimize settler experience. I'm not arguing that we should abandon homesteader histories and stories completely. However, I am saying that we need to celebrate homesteader histories in a way that does not continue to oppress.
Can I ask, are those teepees in the back or are those white tents?
White tents.
Europeans in the background there?
No, in the background, that's Cree homes on reserves. Yeah. In southern Saskatchewan, there's a Ukrainian settlement of Mamornits near the town of Buchanan. In the 1995 local history book for Mamornits is a collection of stories and photos like these ones, which all document the history of the settlement. And the book starts like this. Set in an environment with neither a culture nor a history, these settlers expressed their feelings and longings for their homeland by recreating a domestic landscape patterned after their native villages in Ukraine. Their dazzling whitewashed houses and thatched roofs, log stables, their church architecture complete with a separate bell tower and an adjacent cemetery, their design of the white memorial crosses, together constituted a visual domestic element of the prairie landscape in which they felt at home. What we have here was a little replica of an old homeland in their new adopted land of Canada. Set in an environment with neither culture nor history. What does that mean? How does that influence the way settlers understand their place in history? How does this influence how we think about colonialism? A narrative like this becomes a historical story of pride for the Memorial community and simultaneously a form of oppression. It disregards Indigenous culture and history and positions Ukrainian settlers as the first peoples of the prairies. It fulfills a heroic, making something from nothing narrative, and it also silences settlers' understandings by ignoring the context of colonialism.
Who said that? Whose quote is that?
The quote I read is right from the book.
This quote here?
Yep.
Yeah. And who said it?
It was in the local history book for the Memorial community. The Memorial local history book. Yeah. The thing is that settlers knew that they were not arriving to a prairie environment that was void of culture and history. Settlers witnessed and understood signs of Indigenous histories. For example, Clara Hoffer, who arrived in the Lipton area in 1905 from Bukovina, recalled that there was a bison wallow on her property in which her husband found a bison skeleton complete with arrowheads. Clara also acknowledged that her land was once a place where Indigenous peoples would gather and hunt together. She knew enough about Indigenous history to recognize and understand the purpose of a bison wallow and identify arrowheads as evidence of the land being previously occupied. As for another example here, we have the Korchinski family. They remember, and I quote here, 2 Indian families living in a small mud-plastered shacks a little distance away from the homestead. The Harbus family also recalls that every spring and fall, a group of 40 to 50 Indigenous peoples would camp, trap, and hunt near a lake 50 yards north of the homestead. These everyday stories of homesteading show how settlers understood Indigenous movement, relocation, and life. And it is recognizing the relationships between Ukrainian settlers and Indigenous peoples in homesteading narratives. It is one way to revisit and reposition settler stories into the context of colonialism. And so to do so, let's turn to a story. In 1903 and 1904, 4 brothers, Nick, John, Julian, and Stanley Korchinski, left Galicia and arrived to Saskatchewan with their families to homestead adjoining quarter sections near Ituna. And if we can remember from that map, and if you know where Ituna is, it's in one of the Ukrainian bloc settlements in the southeastern part of this province. So one day in the summer of 1907, John Korchinski took his team of oxen out to the field to rake the hay. As the late afternoon heat dragged on, the wind died down. Black flies began to settle on John and on the oxen. The more the flies began to bite, the more restless the oxen became. As John's family remembers it, the oxen pulled suddenly, and John was tossed into the hayrake and was badly cut up. An Indigenous group passing through the area found John. Years later, John's daughters, Julia and Dorothea, would write that they took him into their tents and cared for him for 2 or 3 days. John was well cared for. He was unable to speak with the Indians, however, he felt they were real brothers. Later, when John's eldest daughter married, Julia and Dorothea remembered, and again I quote, "Many of the neighboring Indians and Métis arrived and attended the wedding, and fit in well, and enjoyed the merriment." While the Korchinskis were homesteading in a Ukrainian settlement, they were also part of a larger community. Their homestead was 5 kilometers from the northern section of a Little Black Bear Reserve. The Korchinskis' home was in the middle of Indigenous displacement from lands. The unnamed group of Indigenous peoples who found John were likely Cree and or Assiniboine Nakota from the Little Black Bear Reserve. The Korchinskis were settling in a landscape that was directly in the midst of Indigenous assimilation and relocation policy and practices. It is hard not to think that the Korchinskis would not have known nor understood to some level what was happening to their Indigenous neighbors. The Korchinski story highlights 2 continuous themes found in settler homesteading memories: witnessing Indigenous movement and personally knowing Indigenous neighbors. Relationships between people and kinship and care cannot be developed without some sort of awareness. John was taken into the homes of his Indigenous neighbors. He, and by extension his family, would have had to interact with, understand, or witness, to a degree, Indigenous confinement and restriction to reserves. And while the Korchinskis may not reflect on this degree of understanding, their stories and experiences are still happening within a specific colonial context. This is all still part of their story. So over 300 kilometers northwest of the Korchinskis was the Harbis' homestead. Ukrainian settler Mike Harbis, his father Joe, arrived in the Alvina area from Galicia in 1898. A year later, Mike was born on the family homestead. Even more years after that, in honor of Saskatchewan's Jubilee, Mike made a miniature replica of the Harbis' homestead. And I'm gonna say, it happens to be in this room with us. It's right there to my left, your right. And so yes, it now sits here. And so what I find interesting about Mike's replica is that he had to make it, and he had to include the neighboring Indigenous camp. Mike could not create his replica of his family's homestead without including evidence of Indigenous presence on the landscape. And visual evidence like this replica here, or there are also teepees found in paintings. There's one just in the other room of this museum that does show teepees in a Ukrainian homestead. This is all visual evidence of Ukrainian presence in Ukrainian settler memories and stories. And this is not a symbolic of a relationship. It is a direct reflection of homesteaders' lived experiences. Mike recalled in his family's personal connection with his Indigenous peoples living near the lake. In Mike's words, sometimes they came to our house for bread and water. Once 2 Indian women came. Mother gave them milk for the babies, bread, and eggs. They left a sealskin jacket and a shawl for her. This recollection is particularly interesting. Mike's mother was given a sealskin jacket, not something you commonly find in southern Saskatchewan. And what Mike is alluding to here, yet not directly acknowledging, is a longer, deeper-rooted history of Indigenous kinship, trade, and relationships that was required to pass a sealskin coat from the hands of an Indigenous woman to the hands of a Ukrainian woman in southern Saskatchewan. And in this story, there's evidence that Mike's family became part of the expansive trade network, and as such, Mike's family would have had to think about the well-established relationships and contexts in which they were engaging. As Mike explains, when I was about 5 or 6, they no longer came because so many people clearing the land had driven away the animals. In this, Mike recognized that the movement of Indigenous peoples followed traditional patterns, including animal migration, and although he did not take direct ownership of this history, Mike did acknowledge that this movement was prevented by settlers clearing the land. Settlers were not vaguely aware that Indigenous communities lived in the region. Rather, they had personal, active contact with Indigenous peoples who moved through their homes and their homesteads. Recognizing these relationships in settler stories and understanding what they mean is the first step in understanding and accepting these actions as settler colonialism. It is a step toward recognizing that Indigenous displacement stories and settler homemaking stories are part of the same narrative. Acknowledging the close-knit nature of these two narratives is a way to ensure that settler stories are no longer a form of oppression. And so now I turn to my final story of tonight. It is a story about the lives of two Ukrainian women, Katerina and Catherine. Katerina was raised in Galicia. In 1903, she left for Canada. At the time, Katerina was pregnant and traveling with her husband, Jan, and their 5 children, 4 of whom were toddlers. After a 900-kilometer railway trip across Eastern Europe with only her suitcase to sit on, a transatlantic voyage spent below water level, another week cramped into a soiled train car, and at least 4 medical and means examinations, 41-year-old Katerina and her family arrived in Saskatchewan. When she arrived, she could neither read nor write in Ukrainian, much less read, write, or speak in English. Catherine and her husband Nick left Ukraine in 1910 to join Catherine's parents in the Altoona area of Saskatchewan. Despite their efforts, Catherine's family were never successful in making a go of it in the last best West. In their first 25 years on the prairies, Catherine's family moved between multiple homesteads. Each time they moved, the family had to restart by building a sod hut. Finally, Catherine and her family moved onto her parents' land. They built a 3-room clay-chinked house with clay floors, and they stayed there for over a decade. Nick and Catherine had 13 children, 5 of whom did not live past the age of 6. Nick is remembered for being a tough old farmer, and Catherine, the neighborhood midwife, is remembered for her sauerkraut, her spotlessly clean clay floors, and her pride in her children for learning to read and write in English. In 1929, Catherine and Nick's 15-year-old daughter, Annie, married Katerina and Jan's 26-year-old son, John. Like their parents, Annie and John struggled to successfully farm. They moved between rented lodgings in Melville and rented homesteads near Judburg. Annie and John had 7 children. Their youngest is my grandfather. Catherine and Nick Kowalik and Katerina and Jan Saas are my great-great-grandparents. And this is my settler family story. So this is a photo of Annie Kowalik, who became Annie Saas, with her 7 children. This is only one of 3 photos that I have of my Ukrainian family. And so there is so much I do not know about the Kowaliks and about the Saas families. Unlike the Korchinskis, who have stories of their relationships with their Indigenous neighbors, and unlike Mike Harbus, who has memories of Indigenous movement and trade, my family does not have that. The only stories I have left are stories about hardship and perseverance. However, that does not mean that my family is exempt. It does not mean that they did not know Indigenous peoples or witness Indigenous displacement and movement. There may be no evidence in my family narratives of relationships with Indigenous peoples, but that does not mean that I do not put my family stories within the context of settler colonialism. The Kwolaks and the Saases broke, plowed, and planted Indigenous lands. Their arrival and their ability to remain in Saskatchewan was dependent on Indigenous displacement and oppression. My family stories are set on a stage of colonialism. And one way that we can think about this is by looking at this history and at these stories on a map. This is just a way to contextualize the landscape and the setting of these stories. So in the orange squares there, that is land that the Saases worked. The Saases never owned land, but they did work as farmhands or rented land in the general area of the two orange squares. The dark blue, almost black-looking square, that's the Kwolak homestead, so that's where Catherine's parents were and where they eventually ended up. And the yellow, which we saw at a zoomed-in scale earlier, is the Korchinski family homestead. These homesteads are within a 130-kilometer radius of 10 residential schools. 5 of them you can see here marked with the red dots. And they are surrounded by reserves. This landscape and what's happening here is happening all at the same time and all in the same places. These homesteading stories, my own included, are not set on a land of neither culture nor history. They are set on Indigenous land and in actions of colonialism. There is a tendency to think about settler homesteading stories as separate from stories of Indigenous displacement and oppression. However, these narratives took place at the same time. They took place in the same spaces. They are connected. And so to end, I'm going to return to the same landscape that in which we began. This is the view from the edge of the Judberg Cemetery. This is the landscape of my settler family stories. We can see here the range road, the cleared trees, and the rock pile to make way for a crop, and the edge of a fence line. This is a land transformed by settlers. The fact that these stories did and could happen on this land makes them part of the settler colonial narrative. It can be hard, uncomfortable, even unsettling work for settlers to understand how their own stories of arrival and homemaking are also part of narratives about Indigenous displacement and relocation. And yet, this is necessary work. This is work that needs to be done for decolonization and for reconciliation. And while the Kwolaks and the Korchinskis, the Harbuses and the Saases may not have seen nor fully understood their arrival as an act of colonialism, it was. And we can recognize this as such now. Therefore, to revisit Ukrainian and non-Ukrainian settler stories in the context of colonialism is to change how these narratives are told. To revisit settler family narratives is to recognize them for what they are: stories of dispossession, suppression, and the oppression of Indigenous peoples through a process we now call settler colonialism. Thank you all for listening.